All right, so we're going to talk about security today. I have the same title as Brett, so he does West Coast Global Services in the US, and I do East Coast, so we have kind of the same weird role. I've been with Liferay since 2010 and a client tech lead architect before that, so we've been doing this for a little while, seen a lot of different issues. So today, security. So this is a survey from a couple of years ago of security professionals, and the question that was asked was, what do you think is the #1 security threat? And the answer was application level layer vulnerabilities, right? Which is the tier that a lot of us live in, right? We're building stuff in the application tier. Liferay lives right there. And many organizations, and I hope you guys are the exception, that you're addressing this better than I see a lot of the time, right? Better than some of the big names that are out there. So if you're not, what I'm trying to do today is to remind you, encourage you, to think about security at each phase of your projects. So when do you think about it? When do you think about security? You've got to kind of do it all the time. And it's not something you do all day long, but it's something you do at each phase of the project. So let's start with design. And so this is kind of the outline of my talk. Let's talk about each phase of the project, and I'm going to finish with an example of a hack that one of my clients went through and walk you through what that looks like and how we dealt with it. So in the design phase, let me remind you of a few security fundamentals. The first one is, what's your attack surface? Okay? This is the surface of your application, of your environment that somebody could use to inject data, to take control, to do something with, right? So the attack surface is an important concept when you're thinking about security in your project, and especially during design. When you're building something new, how does it affect your attack surface? Second concept, which hopefully you already know these, but I think it's worth reviewing, defense in depth, right? Don't rely on just one thing to secure your implementation, okay? So don't just rely on the developer doing something or your monitoring picking things up or one security feature, right? You're always looking for making it harder for the hacker to get what they want. And in my hack example, I'll show you kind of how that works, right? They were able to get in, but we were able to shut them down at a later step. So that layer defense is really important. And the principle of release privilege, right? Give users, processes, any kind of actor in your system only the access to do what they need to do, and no more, right? So limit them to just what they should be doing. So that's key, and these are all principles that Liferay pays a lot of attention to. We have a whole security team that looks at these. So what is the attack surface for Liferay? This is a diagram from our documentation site from dev.liferay or customer.liferay if you're an enterprise user. And there's a lot of pieces here, right? There's a lot of inputs, there's a lot of integration points. This is just stock. This is a diagram with collaboration and web experience, forms. And then if you're like most of my clients, you're adding stuff. Right? You're customizing. My last big client had 15 integration points. So the attack surface is a lot bigger than what you see on our documentation site. Because you've added all this stuff. That's why you bought Liferay in most cases, because you know you can add those in. Right? You know you can use Service Builder or add a REST service. You have these existing and easy to extend APIs so that you can do all that. And all those things increase your attack surface. So you want to be thinking about what do we do from a security standpoint, and how do we control that? How do we manage the inputs? How do we deal with the outputs? But in reality, your attack surface is even larger. This is another diagram from our documentation site, right? Just a simple architecture. So Liferay is down here in the application server tier, right? Second from the bottom. But a hacker can find any of those angles to get into your system. So somebody on your team, and it's probably not every single developer, but someone needs to be thinking about, hey, our attack surface is more than just Liferay. It's all the pieces that go around it. Okay? So in the design phase, when you're saying, hey, I'm going to add 15 more lines, which is what happened to me, 15 lines from the application server in and out through the firewall, and we're poking holes, and we're doing all this, how are we managing the security aspects there? So there are a couple of surveys and reviews and principles that are out there. The OWASP top 10 is a big one people pay attention to. It's one that Liferay references and we pay attention to, the practices that are listed there. This CWE SANS survey of the top 25 issues that people run into is a couple years old now, but they summarize some practices and some mitigations you can do on your project that will help secure your system. So #1 of the general practices is use libraries and frameworks, right? don't reinvent the wheel, right? Don't code your own encoding solution or encryption algorithm. The odds are you're not going to, no offense, I'm sure you're all very, very smart. But the odds are you're not going to do as well as a full team that's dedicated to it and really understands the space. The second one is integrating into the entire software development lifecycle. So I'm talking about that today. This is why I'm going through each of these sequences, right? Have that included in your process so that security is something you think about all the time, at least at some level. Number 3 is use a mix of methods for finding and preventing, and I'd say in production as well, detecting what happens, right? What the weaknesses are. How do you block it, when you're in development? How do you test for it? How do you see if you had some kind of breach? And the fourth one is, and many of us have lockdown clients that are interacting with our systems, especially in the world of microservices. Figure out a way to lock those down so that things are safe. So their mitigations from this paper are, they wrap them up into these 5, summarize them in these 5. A lot of it's common sense, but you want to think about it when you're developing this new portlet or this new integration point. Get control of your inputs. Know what they are. Get control of your outputs. Classic one is any kind of user-contributed content. I'm sure you all completely trust your users, but in the mix of your users is probably a hacker. So you don't want to just display the content they gave you without thinking about, hey, do I need to escape that HTML? Should I strip the JavaScript? What do I do with this content, right? And if you make use of standard software, including Liferay's tag libraries and the like, then you have some protection there. Locking down your environment. So I'm going to go through in a minute here on implementation and talk through what that looks like. But lock it down. Think about security. Use those principles to protect yourself. And don't with, what's the phrase? Security by obfuscation, right? Don't think that because no one can read your code that you're safe. You have to assume someone's going to be able to read your code. Whether it's an inside job or they just find a way to see your code, you still want your system to function and be secure, even if somebody can read all your code. Liferay is open source. You can see our code, so we have to rely on that, and you should too with anything that you're building. And I already mentioned this, but industry-accepted security features, especially encryption algorithms and the like, try to follow those practices and use what's off the shelf. So the phrase is secure by default or secure by design. That's the principles that the security team uses, that Liferay uses. And we could argue, we had some arguments yesterday, an energetic conversation around whether Liferay's definition of secure by default is secure enough, right? So your opinion may vary, but it's a reasonable place to start, right? What you get with Liferay out of the box is a reasonable place to begin. But it's sensitive to how you configure your server. It's sensitive to what things you deploy. If you pull things off a marketplace, you add your own customizations especially, that matters a lot. And this is, I think Brett emphasized this in his talk, patching level. Those fix packs are coming out on a weekly cadence right now, which is hard to keep up with, but you want to figure out what your sensitivity is. Like, how often should I be doing it? It shouldn't be every 15 months. You want to pick up a service pack, because that includes security fixes as well as bug fixes. Don't wait too long, because it does matter. Okay, so that's your philosophy. That's kind of the design phase and the things you should be thinking about from a security standpoint. Let's get into some kind of a laundry list here of what do you do during implementation. So when you're building your special house, it's got Liferay somewhere, it's one of the pieces in there. I'm going to start from the bottom and build our way out. So on the operating system side, these are just kind of technical things, right? Don't use root. And this is kind of a practice across the board. Again, this is the principle of least privilege, right? At the operating system, don't run Tomcat or your application server of choice as root. Sandbox it, right? Give it its own account, give it its access to its own locations and nothing else, right? That's one way to protect yourself. So it's a dedicated temp location, just so you don't have file overruns or whatever. Write access to the deploy directory. So we tend to discourage, in fact, we recommend not using hot deploy in production, even though it's such a handy feature from a development standpoint. One way to enforce that is to lock that directory down after deploys. So we've done that on several clients where we open it up during the deploy and then we lock it down again afterwards. You may want to run the deploy as a different user, maybe backups are run as a different user. Access to backups is also maybe from a different account. So that's a way to kind of segregate who can see those things. And if somebody gets access to Liferay, they don't have access to shut down the server, for instance. Okay. Okay, layered security going through. So this is, again, some basic stuff here, but you shouldn't let, this is, each layer can only see the next one. It's kind of the idea of layered security, right, in part. You probably shouldn't open up port 80 or 8080 on the Tomcat to the world. You don't want to let somebody see down deep into a database management console, right? And usually there's a lot of clients, my larger clients have a security team that, like, they're preaching this all the time, right? Lock it down, use the firewall, only open up what you have to. Related to that is not mixing environments. So we had some conversations at the conference yesterday about like how do you get content from a dev or a UAT environment into production. I tend to recommend against publishing from UAT or dev straight to production, because now you've mixed your environments. You've got a different user base, you've expanded your attack surface, so somebody can get into UAT, they have some way to get into your prod server as well. This is a big one, and it's not always obvious how to do it, but at the OS level, disable anything you don't need. Shut down the ports, shut down the features, whitelist the ones you are using. And especially in the web service, and this is old school technologies, right? But CGIs and PHPs, turn them off, don't use the defaults out there. And especially management interfaces. Sometimes I'll see that the management console in Tomcat or your server of choice is already open and you can see it from outside. That provides way too much information and gives a really easy attack point to a hacker, excuse me. So at the Liferay level, there are lots of options here. And I know we're shifting in DXP. It's not done yet. We're shifting from portal properties, which in 6.2, I'm curious in this room, 6.2 users or 6.1? Okay, DXP? Yeah. So we got a mix, right? So in 6.2, I could say, go look at portal properties and search for security. And you get a lot of clues and all the things that are in there, right? Some of that stuff is migrating into the config files, but the idea is similar. There's a lot of options in there. And what you want to do is go through and start turning off the stuff that you're not going to need, right? Reduce your attack surface. There are, I don't know, 12, 15 SSO implementations. You're not using all of them. You might be using one or none, right? So turn those guys off. In OSGI and DXP, you can disable components you're not going to use. And there's some disagreements around the best way to do this. We have, in some builds, just deleted LPKGs. It's part of our build process. They're included in the service packs, in the bundle you get, but you can just delete them, right, if you're not using them. There's a new feature in FixPack 30, which lets you blacklist it with a config file. It's a little tricky to play with, because then there's dependencies. You've got to figure out that idea. But it lets you, from FixPack 30 on, decide, hey, I'm not going to use blogs. Let's go identify those modules and turn them off, right? So it's good from a startup standpoint. It's going to be faster. It's good from an attack surface standpoint as well. Disabling user private pages. This is a key one. If you give a user private pages, which is sometimes a business requirement, but if it's not, you're giving them access as a site admin basically in their own little group. They can add content. They can start injecting things. They can be adding files to your server. I tend to recommend turning that one off. And a lot of my clients are enterprise, and they don't want to have that kind of feature anyway. And remote staging. Staging's been a story for the last year and a half. But it's a great feature. It's getting more and more stable by the day. Definitely if you're using remote staging, upgrade to the latest fix pack, because there's a lot of fixes still coming in on that. But that's another way to secure things in a layered way, because your remote staging server can be very tightly controlled, not visible to the outside world. Only your content team can use it. Those users aren't in the live site. You can lock down editing on the live server as well, and it really lets you separate those use cases. All right, the content side, and this is where a lot of teams get into trouble, especially when you're building your own stuff. Again, this comes back to controlling your inputs, controlling your outputs. Make sure you're doing validation, client side and server side. Make sure you're escaping any content. So and that's especially where you get the XSS and the CSRF attacks, right? You're trying to block those. The anti-SAMI, this is a change in DXP. The anti-SAMI plugin was an option you could include in 6.2, and I believe in 6.1 as well. In DXP now, it's enabled by default. It's not, the default configuration doesn't include journal articles, so web contents won't have anti-SAMI running, but you can choose which portlets are going to use that, and that handles the stripping, hopefully any malicious JavaScript and that kind of thing from the content. A big one is making the right use of role-based access control. So for a lot of folks, it's a little complicated to get used to it, but RBAC is a key feature in Liferay. Right? Making use of those roles is a key way to say, I'm going to give this guy right here access to do Some really good things, but nothing else. All right? And in your custom code, I always say this because I see it done the other way too many times. When you're writing your role checks, don't ask the question, does this guy have role whatever that I just built? The right question is, does this user have access to perform action Y? Because that's the way that you can really make the role-based stuff flexible. Okay, next question. I saw a lot of hands here on your servers. How many of you have logged in as a full-on capital A administrator account in a production server in the last month? Okay, locally? I'm sure if you're running your own servers, you're probably doing it as well, right? I raised my hand, not just as an example for you, but I've done it myself, right? That is dangerous as heck, okay? Stock roles, but especially administrator, is such an easy attack vector. If they get in there, they can do anything. Shut the server down, deploy portlets, unless you lock down the deploy folder, right? So administrator, and the other thing about it is administrator can do anything. So if you care about roles and permissions, you're not testing the site like any real user if you're logged in as administrator. So from the security angle alone, that's a big one, to figure out what the right role is for your day-to-day management, and maybe only use administrator when you have to. And I'll talk about some other things you can do to lock that one down more. I think it's also true for site administrator to a lesser degree. It's really good if you have the time to fine-tune those roles. All right, custom services. Like I say, many people buy Liferay and use Liferay to build their own stuff. And often security is an afterthought. If you use Service Builder to do those custom services, there's some security baked in. You have to be authenticated by default to make use of it. But if you're going on DXP, there's a lot more options for REST services. You can just use annotations. It's a lot simpler. There's not nearly as much generated, like no generated code. It's just a single class. If you're doing that, you need to be thinking about how you're going to consistently apply permissions. Like, how are you consistently going to be controlling access to your services? So somebody on your team needs to be thinking about that. If you are using Service Builder, which I really like, I mean, I know people have, it has its pros and cons, but if you use Service Builder and you do a remote service and it creates a JSON API for you, that's immediately visible in API JSON WS. How many people have used that? Have you seen that? Right? It gives you the discoverable view of all the JSON services. It's so handy, but anybody can see it. So my last client with 15 integration points, all their services are readily available just by going to that one URL. So one option is to lock that down. It's a quick customization to say, you can't log in here unless you've got control panel access. Or you can't see this page unless you are a certain type of user. And heaven help us, please don't write XML by hand. Don't write JSON by hand. There's way too many libraries already in Liferay. It's just an easy way to have problems. And I already mentioned REST services. Please check them. A little to tip on practices. On our teams, we try to do we basically do like a two-reviewer rule, so that, and security folds in here. So our basic rule is, I want to lead reviewing all code, and at least somebody else from the team. So basically 2 reviewers on anything that comes in. And the idea is then that the entire team owns this. It's not just the tech lead who's the one who owns security. It's everyone on the team who thinks about that aspect of it. And that's a basic agile practice, right? The code base isn't, this area isn't Jim's. It's the entire team that owns it. Anybody can do anything, even though some people are a little better at some stuff. Patching tool I mentioned, please use it, please apply it, please fold it into your deployment process. And antivirus scans, I don't think a lot of people know this is available. We have an out-of-the-box integration with ClamAV. It works pretty well. I think there's a fix coming out right now. It doesn't use a daemon, so it takes like 9 seconds to initialize when you scan a file. That's an easy fix to get around. So I consider using that. It's also extendable, so you can integrate with your own antivirus implementation if you want to. Okay, just some quick tips on quality. A few bullets here on the places you could be thinking about security on your team. The first one, if you have a quality team that is doing the normal stuff, they're doing functional testing, and they're doing, like, I'm going to try to fill out this field and make it really long. I'm going to try this field and include JavaScript. And I'm going to try this one and inject some SQL and see what happens, right? So that's pretty standard. I don't think we always do enough, at least with the clients I see, of automating some of that, right? Making sure that in manual tests and automated tests, I'm trying to break it. And I know that, hey, there was this attack vector I was worried about. Let's put an automated test on it and make sure it keeps working. So I mentioned the whole don't use administrator. That was one that we added. We put a rule in to say, you can't log in as an administrator account unless you're inside the internal network, and then we automated that test to make sure that that rule still applied. Roles and permissions, this came up yesterday too in the unconference. So roles and permissions are tricky, right? Because they can get pretty complicated. If you're like a lot of clients, you've got a deep hierarchy of content, and some of it is visible to anybody, and some of it is protected to certain users, and then you've got roles over here, and how do you know that that's, and maybe there's some sensitive content that only the C-level should see, and how do you make sure that still works a month from now? It worked when you first set it up, but is it still working later? Those are really great places to test. Periodic security scans of some type, some kind of pen testing. We partner with VeraCode to test Liferay itself. They've done well by us, and I know there are some, obviously, pen testing firms in Europe as well. Okay, let me talk briefly about production, and I call this awareness, and this is how do you know what's going on in your production system? How do you know if you've been breached? What do you do? There's a lot of pieces here. The basic story is that first line, right? Get a system in place. Get a system in place for detecting intrusions. And it's going to vary a lot based on your system. So it's kind of a laundry list here. You could buy one off the shelf. There are IDS systems out there. I personally haven't had a lot of experience with them. I have seen a WAF, and Liferay's URLs are complicated, so it didn't work perfectly. There's always some training involved with those systems. I've had good luck with APM tools like Dynatrace or New Relic. They give you some of this, and you can set baselines and say, hey, if this thing happens, throw an alert. Certainly, what Brett talked about with the AWS talk is you want to capture logs. This is key. And I know with GDPR coming out, there are questions about what do you do with user data and what does that mean going forward. But for detecting breaches, you need as much data as possible. So capturing your web server logs, capturing your application server logs, doing some kind of click tracking so you can tell, hey, user X logged in, and they did this, and this resource was retrieved, and oh yeah, they tried to upload this file, and it failed, and then they tried to do this, and I'll show you in my hack example kind of how that story can unfold. One that can be really helpful, and I don't see everyone doing it because it takes a little bit to implement. It's not real hard, but is tagging your logs so that from Apache or Nginx all the way through to Tomcat, you have like an ID that says, this is this HTTP request, and I know everything that happened on this request, or everything happened on this session. And then you can get a view of, oh, wow, this is what that user was trying to do, and I don't like it. So what do we do to mitigate that? Another one everybody's using, because it's not enabled by default, is the audit portlet. How many have tried it? How many are using audit portlet? Yeah, that's what I thought. A couple hands, 10%. It's not perfect. It's easy to add your own events. Out of the box, it gives you this person logged in. This person impersonated another user. They viewed this page. They tried to do these things. Pretty handy. Yeah, so AWS has some of its own tools. Again, this is for me, at every single client, we're kind of inventing what's the system that works best for this situation so we can get that data. All right, so in production, some of that turns into, like we often build a health check portlet. Brett mentioned this as well for AWS. So we have some way to say, what's healthy in my system? Which portlet should be there? Like, how many users should have a certain number of roles? How many admins are there really? Right? So you're looking for changes in those things that are important to you. Regular reports, in this one, we have a reporting portlet, but like asking, I mentioned this whole, how do you know that your roles and permissions are still working? Some kind of survey, automated hopefully, to say, I want these pages to still be protected in this way, right? And walking that on some schedule. Because then when things change, you have some clues. And like I say, monitor it. I don't know what it is for you, because you've got your own business and your own implementation, but figure out a way to throw flags out there when it changes. And usually, early on in implementation, you're going to have a developer or developers that are keeping an eye on the system, looking for exceptions, looking for weird stuff, and capturing those and categorizing them and then flagging them when they go bad. All right, so what happens when it goes bad? So I've been with a number of clients. I've seen a number of hack events. So I want to walk you through a real-world scenario. Names have been changed to protect the innocent. And the game here with this kind of forensics, right, is to try to piece together what happened. What did they get access to? Right? The whys you almost never get, right? But at least what were they doing in our system, and how do we prevent it from going forward, and who do we have to notify, and all that stuff. Okay. So this is the example. Again, real story. So the hacker, in this case, just a user at this step, they created an account. Business requirement, that's allowed. They weren't doing anything special. They just created an account. But now they're in, right? They're a site member. They then added a message boards post with a link, just a URL, also could be perfectly innocent. Step 3, though, the URLs in the forums, and we've got our moderators who are looking at that content, and one of our privileged users clicks on it. Turns out the link carried it back to our single sign-on server, which then followed a redirect back to the hacker server, not back to Liferay. Okay, if you know the OWASP top 10, you just broke a rule right there. Nonetheless, there's now a security token sitting over in the hacker server. So now with that token, they can log into Liferay as the privileged user. So now they're playing games, right? So step 4, they got the token. Step 5, they're logged in as a site administrator. Step 6, they go in and they start creating, they added some site-level JavaScript, which is a callback to their server. So now any token that comes in, you log in, you didn't use that link out the message boards, your token gets sent, just sent right over some little URL, right? Just sends it over to the server. So now they're capturing sessions, and they can get in, and at some point, they capture an administrator account. Okay, so now the world's ending, right? The sky is falling. They can log in as administrator. And they escalate privileges to administrator. Then they say, hey, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to deploy some portlets. This is my client, so I get a lot of blame here, right? We had done some stuff right, and you'll see where it went right. But this is not good, right? They're deploying portlets. Their own stuff, like JSPs that are reading files off the file system and trying to execute code. We could tell from the logs what had happened. So now they lost their session, they tried to log in again, and now we kick them out. So they basically, in a running session, had escalated their privileges, but now our customization that said, you can't log in as administrator unless you're inside the network, blocks them. And at this point, our flags start going off that, hey, there was these failed deploys. These portlets aren't supposed to be there, and they are. What went on? And the ops team jumps in, and they do the quick stuff of, oh my gosh, lock the server, delete the user's account, try to clean things up. And then this is where, so we actually had some flags, we actually had some clues of what went on, but the timing's not awesome, right? The timing from when they first got in, we could tell from the logs, because we captured all those things I talked about. We had the audit portlet turned on, we had all the logs captured. We could tell that they first started doing this stuff, I think it was 4 to 6 weeks before we knew about it. The time from when they escalated privileges to us noticing was hours, so that's better. If they hadn't tried to deploy portlets, that was the tripwire that they hit, it would have been longer. And full data analysis really took us weeks to try to piece it together and see, it was a breach, yeah, but was there any data loss? Did they get to any sensitive data from users or from the proprietary stuff? And it turned out they didn't, because they didn't ask the right questions. But that's the story there. So let me go through the mitigations real quick. So this is the same steps that the user went through and what we should have done and what we did following this breach. So 1, 2, no changes, those are business requirements. You have to be able to create accounts, you gotta be able to put message boards posts out there. We were already using BB code, which I recommend if you're not already. If you give the users ability to put full HTML in, you gotta at least turn on anti-SAMI. If you just give them any access to do that stuff, you're gonna be in trouble. Step 3 was some training on social engineering, right? Don't just, hey, admins, please don't follow any link you see, okay? Obvious stuff. Step 2 was whitelist and redirect IPs, and in fact, the SSO server, a pen tester had noticed it 6 months earlier, and they said, it's not a problem, we won't fix it. They fixed it after this. And I think it was a career-generating event, actually. What's the phrase? Resume-generating event in this case. Somebody lost their job. Step 5, we improved the rules about kicking you out if you have too much permission. You have to be inside the network to do certain stuff. And then a couple more. We turned off impersonation, which is on by default. We removed some more permissions about getting administrator access. And we disabled hot deploys outside maintenance, which I mentioned by turning those permissions off. And we refined a few other permission checks. So we had a lot of mitigations. It could have been a lot worse for us, though. All right, Brett did better than I did, 11 seconds. I got 5. My challenge to you is, please be in the news about using Liferay for good reasons. Not because you're one of these breaches with 100 million users lost, okay? Thanks.
Thanks, Nathan. Guys, we have time for 2, 3 questions. Any questions?
And you won't offend me, it's lunchtime, so if you need to go eat, I'm cool. You can find me around.
Okay, if you don't have questions, we just have one video. It's like a 2-minute video. We have a question? Great.
Hi. When is Liferay going to start a bounty program?
Sorry, where was that?
I didn't say.
When will Liferay start a bounty program?
A bounty program for finding bugs, finding security hacks.
Yep.
I will have to defer that to the security team. Any security engineers in here want to field that one? I can ask. I don't know. I haven't heard of any plan for that.
Any other questions? No.
Oh,
So-
it was Magnuson back. Yeah, I figured.
So please, yeah. Ross. Oh, wait a minute, please. The microphone, if we don't have the microphone, the recording.
Yeah, maybe a
that-
really stupid question, but you said that Liferay needs to be run as a Liferay user in the Unix systems, which I agree with.
Just pick your own. Yeah, it doesn't matter what the user
or
is.
Some user, yeah, some non-privileged user.
Right.
Do you know if there's any way, because for example in Docker, you can create a user and can run a process under a user there in the instances, but what about the TMPFS? Do you know if there is any way to use TMPFS with non-root if you want to store your temp files?
Right,
somehow?
right. Yeah, I don't know offhand. Sorry.